The way in which Wales as a country united or was disunited follows the absolute norm across most of European countries. In fact, what makes us different is that our next door neighbor was the exception to most of Europe in that it unified so early, directly next door, which was much bigger than us. And in this video, we're going to go into what that did to us and how we built our own High King of Wales to say that we are unified as a nation. This is ben.llywelyn. That's what this video is about today. To understand how Wales was united, we have to understand why it was divided and how it became just a hopeless, anarchic situation which allowed a strong man to emerge. The southeast in the early 9th century was quite strong and stable compared to the north and west. In the north and west, heirs ran out, dynasties were dying out and plummeting into civil war, and nowhere was this more pronounced than Gwyn A, which had probably formed originally out of a amalgamation of clans anyway. We're not sure. There's a shady figure that emerges onto the stage in Gwyn A named Rhodri the Great, who claims descent from Powysyn nobility on one side, and on the other from Ogledd, the Old North in North Britain, on the other. Convenient that none of his royal line came from Gwyn A. He didn't have to have any evidence to back it up, I suppose. He was a usurper. And he nudged his way into the royal court of Gwyn A and got into bed with a woman of the royal family, Ethill ferch Cynan, the daughter of Cynan. And so he had some foothold into the court through that relationship. But he entered into this marriage during a very unstable time. In 810, a bovine plague swept across Wales, meaning the cattle, the cows, the wealth subsistence we traded in cattle at the time were wiped out, meaning that men of status, what you measured their status by, was suddenly gone. And into this, Gwyn stepped in, claiming royal descent. The very next year in 811, the royal court at Dyganwy was struck by lightning. It was supposedly an ancient wooden edifice, a royal court of splendor with ornate carvings, burned to the ground. The very next year, a civil war broke out between Cynan and his brother or cousin, we're not sure which, lasting for 4 years, in which Ynys Môn was devastated. And it should be of note that Gwyn the Great had married Cynan's daughter, and Cynan lost. And so Gwyn had sided with the losing side, probably fled to Ireland for a moment, we're not sure, but Hywel reigns for a time. However, because of Ethill, Gwyn's son, Mervyn Vrich, can claim royal descent even though the line officially passes through male lineage. It should be noted that during this civil war, 814, down south, the royal lineage ran out, and Llwg and Dyfed were plunged into a very uncertain time, lots of infighting down there. Immediately after this civil war, in 817, Cornwulf of Mercia invaded, occupying Rhufeiniog, one of the most fertile areas of the kingdom of Gwyn A, present-day Dyffryn Clwyd. In 818, there's a battle at Llanfaes, of all places, which was the royal court of Cynan. But Cynan is not supposed to be alive at this point, so we're not sure who was fighting there, whether this was Mercians even or who, but we know Hywel was still reigning after this, so he was victorious from whatever battle took place here. In 823, Mercia invaded again, this time burning down Deganwy, which had just recently been rebuilt. Very unlucky. It would get burned down quite a few more times in history. However, this was beginning to look to people like this guy was weak. Mercia has invaded twice and we've suffered a civil war. What is going on? And so just 2 years later, 825, Mervyn Vrich, the son of Gwriad, takes power by claiming maternal descent. Now this was very unusual. Hey, what are you doing? This is unorthodox. We don't do things this way. But he did it anyway, claiming the right to rule through his mother, not his father. And this would go on to happen a lot, this maternal claim, from this point forward. Mervyn Vrich's dynasty would create Rhodri the Great, and from him Aberfraw, the dynasty. So from this moment that Mervyn Vrich takes the throne, it spurs into motion a series of dominoes that really does produce almost all of Wales's greatest rulers in a military sense. That's important to note for later dynasties and later videos. Mervyn Vrich, now king of Gwynedd, was astutely aware of how he came to power through his father, who married into the royal lineage, and so he made sure that his wife was from another kingdom of that aristocracy. From Powys, which was then quite weak, he married Nest, knowing that Mercia was forcing Powys into a defensive position, and his son Rhodri the Great could then simply claim the kingdom of Powys through his mother, just like his father had done Gwynedd. And so Rhodri claimed 2 kingdoms simply by right of the female lines, which there were people that clearly did not like this, but he was just, well, are you going to stop me? And he did it anyway. And then, knowing that the south was divided and weak, he took a wife himself from the south, named Angharad, from the dynasty of Seisilwg. This meant that later on during his reign, he was simply able to inherit much of the south. They knew the right woman to choose to keep their kingdom. Hey, if you're liking this video, press that like button. Diolch, thanks. And so 3 times in a row, you have a king saying through his female line that he has the right to be king. And he defeated Danes who invaded, ravaging Ynys Môn. He even had to flee to Ireland at one point, and he defeated Mercians coming into his territory, pushing them back. In the end, they did kill him, Rhodri the Great, but his son Anawraud avenged his death 1 year later by defeating the Mercians, and that's important. It's a battle called Dial Diwm Rhodri, the revenge of God for Rhodri. One thing I would like to note about Rhodri Fawr is Llandudno Beach. He defeated a Viking invasion right there, and yet all we have now is a ridiculous statue to Alice in Wonderland, which has nothing to do with our country. We don't even have a plaque, a commemoration, anything to note this great victory, which in all likelihood preserved the independence of the Kingdom of Gwynedd for 2 centuries. I just find that a bit sad. Now, just to note on the word great, this is not some title came up out of thin air. This was a context of the age. Rhodri the Great was proclaiming in the same heritage as Charlemagne the Great, who had reigned just before his life. And Alfred the Great in England was a near contemporary. And across Europe, you have these people at the same time calling themselves the Great to found these new political nation states, and Wales was part of that tradition. In present-day Germany, you had Otto the Great. In the Basque country in northern Spain, you had Sancho III, the Great of Nevers. In Bulgaria, you had Simeon the Great. In Moravia, an early ancestry state of the Czech people, you had Rhodri the Great, which was quite big at one time. And in present-day Ukraine and Kiev, you had Vladimir the Great. So Rhodri was not doing something superficial here. He was playing to a wider field, proclaiming his intentions of what he wanted Wales to be. One Wales, one nation, one king, and in his grandson, there would come one law. Carrying forward his grandson was Hywel Dda of the south. Hywel Dda married Ellen of the Dyfed line. Now when Rhodri had moved in, a lot of those aristocrats had gone to the kingdoms of Wessex's court. They never forgot that Wessex had harbored them from their enemies, and so the pillar of King Hywel Dda, Hywel the Good's policy was to align with Wessex because he was astutely aware of what Wessex had just done to our British or Brythonic brother nation or sister nation in Cornwall. They had subjugated them, wiped out their independent existence, and he was keenly aware not to follow that. We could be snuffed out, so I suppose he took the Godfather model of keep your friends close and your enemies closer, allowing him to claim all of Deheubarth. This alliance with Wessex did something incredibly unique. The Viking raids stop. I mean, these raids had devastated, especially in Deheubarth, but all of Ynysmon, all of the areas which he came to rule had been devastated by these Viking raids, and suddenly there's no real evidence that they're coming in and burning things for a while, around 940s from then on, at least until his death. And it appears that he arranged something with Wessex to buy people off. And in this, there's a cultural flourishing that we see a renaissance of Welsh culture, but not so much a renaissance, but a first naissance, a first true birth that explodes our understanding of ourselves. He was the first Welsh kingdom in coins that we know of. Hywel Rex, Hywel King, these coins say. And he gave a newly unified Welsh kingdom a Welsh law when he called a cynulleidfa, a grouping of peoples from all the cantrefi of his kingdom. Cantrefi is an administrative unit, literally 100 townships more or less. A parish, a near equivalent would be parish. Cantrev comes from cant or drefi, 100 little towns. You get the idea. And this parliament at Hendy Gwyn, in present day South Sirgyrfyrddin, this gives us the word today cynulleidfa, ymgynnull, to gather together, and cynulliad is the word for assembly in our language. This comes directly from this moment. And when we got our first Home Rule elected body in Wales, the cynulliad, which came into form in 1999, it was called that for a time before being upgraded to Senedd. This codification of law was the essential step common to all of Europe in the transformation of a monarchy into a nation. And a nation was emerging in written literature in the monasteries, especially in the south of Hywel Dda's kingdom. Scribes were commenting, annotating Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy and Ovid's Ars Amatoria. I should mention that we have our own word for the poet Ovid, Ovid. This shows that these Latin writers were important to us. Virgil, Fetish, we were aware of these from an early date. And this work, Ars Amatoria, Kelv Cariad, the art of love, we were engrossed in classical Roman antiquity as the foundation of Welsh civilization. We loved it. And we enter a blooming of culture toward the very end of Hywel Dda's reign, and this High King of Wales. To there we produced Annales Cambriae, the Annals of Wales. It's mostly about Cymru, but the events hold as well to Ireland, Cornwall, England, Scotland, France, and even further afield. And then, in the same region and time, the Historia Britannium, written around 828, but was copied and carried on by these scribes, multiplied in number and spread throughout the land. This gives us the earliest source of King Arthur as an historical figure. This is not to be confused with Historia Regnum Britanniae, which came into being later, but were directly inspired by the Historia Britannium. And the tales of the Mabinogi are clearly rooted in the southwest, around Pryderi, who was the only character to appear in all four of these ancient mythical tales. And what we think we have here is a lost saga, and what we have are just tiny fragments around the edges of that which have been passed down to us, and likely entire books full of tales have been lost. We have the triads that these Cyfarwyddion, storytellers, and Berth, poets, had to know. And there were probably hundreds of these stories, many of them written down in, for example, Tydewi, around which the cult of Dewi Sant, our national saint, St. David, was blooming from, in this fertile South Pembrokeshire region and Sir Gaerfyrddin. And it's Hywel Dda's peace which enables this blooming, combined with the order of law. We are encapsulating knowledge about ourselves for the first time, squishing together. Like the last 6 videos that I've made, we are literally writing our own versions of what happened, encapsulating the stories of King Arthur, Magnus Maximus into Max Wledig, Saint Germanus into Saint Garmon, or Garmon's saint, the tyrant Gorthern, Myrddin, the wizard Merlin, all of these things, saying, we understand that we are Welsh now, but we are the inheritance of all of those British things that came before. We are the British. It is our responsibility to preserve our inheritance. We've lost most of our island. This is what we are now, and we're trying to make sense of how we got here. How are we the smaller partner on our island when King Hywel Dda has to submit to Alfred of Wessex in order to play the smart game? Because Cornwall they tried to fight. Strathclyde in the north continued to fight, and then later on, 937, they held on a bit longer, but then the Kingdom of Scots and we the Welsh were aware of what could happen to us, and we took the more sensible, diplomatic way to preserve our independence, to keep on existing as a nation, and to actually fully form as a nation under one king, which is what happened next. After Hywel Dda, it broke down into mayhem, but then another High King, the last true High King of Wales, emerged, ben Llywelyn. And I call him the Angry King, and that angry man who does not seem happy at all with submitting to Wessex or any English king, who throws out that order of diplomacy and amasses armies and comes to victory after victory, is what we come to in the next episode. Thank you, diolch yn fawr iawn, for reaching the end of this video. If you enjoy this content and want to contribute to sustaining this channel, Please join me on Patreon. Everything that I make is going back into building this channel. As always, to each and every one of you who do simply watch, diolch yn fawr iawn, thank you very much for watching.